Will you pray with me? Oh God, out of the busyness, the hecticness, the noisiness of our lives, we do turn to you. Grant us in these moments a sense not just of silence, but stillness. And out of the silence and stillness, may we together and we singly hear your invitation to follow. Then give us courage to respond for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of the world, for the sake of our own lives. Amen. The year was 1972. I was fresh out of college, unemployed, living at home with my parents, desperately looking for work, any kind of work, even more desperately trying to figure out the next part of my life, and even uncertain about what I wanted to do with my life itself. Little did I know how much my life was about to change and how that would happen with the help of a sink full of dirty dishes, a static-filled AM radio, and a hillbilly preacher. Looking for something to do, since binge-watching Game of Thrones or House of Cards or even old reruns of I Love Lucy and Gilligan's Island was not an option in 1972. I volunteered several days a week at Immaculate Conception, the nearby Catholic elementary school. And when spring break came around, I jumped at the chance to chaperone a youth group mission trip to rural Kentucky, the heart of Appalachia. Each morning we prepared for the day's work that week with a hearty breakfast and a brief time of worship, followed by cleanup, brushing teeth, making beds, sweeping floors, washing the breakfast dishes. As we did our chores, the little plug-in radio in the kitchen was tuned into the only station we could get, a station that was heavy on religion and light on the music favored by suburban Buffalo teenagers. As it happened, the featured programming from 8:15 to 8:30 every morning was devoted to Bible teaching and preaching by some little-known local preacher. At the beginning of the week, I listened with a sense of curiosity about what he might have to say. By the middle of the week, I was equal parts amused and outraged by the lessons he taught and the theology he espoused, and by the end of the week, I shuddered at what I heard. My spirit groaned within me, and I said to myself these words: God deserves better. That's all it took. That's how God got my attention. Now, I'm not proud of that fact. In fact, I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that that was my call to ministry. But 2 months later, as clueless and hapless as any of Jesus' disciples, I was invited to be the pastor of 2 struggling churches in the city of Buffalo, and even though I did my utter best to wheedle out of it, here I stand 46 years later, the course of my life having been interrupted and totally altered by the voice of God coming through that scratchy radio and that unknown hillbilly preacher. How did God get me to say yes to this path for my life when I had so many other possible plans and directions for myself? I really can't explain it. Any more than Simon and Andrew and the sons of Zebedee could explain what happened to them that day by the Sea of Galilee when they dropped everything to follow an unknown stranger named Jesus. What would cause anyone to turn their life in a radically new direction? What would cause you to turn your life in a whole new direction? The gospel writers are glaringly silent about the reasons for the disciples' decisions and actions that day. All we know is that Jesus beckoned, "Follow me." And in the blink of an eye, they jumped up and followed. Were they bored with their lives? We don't know. Had they grown weary with the relentlessness of their work? Was their home life less than satisfactory? Had they made too many of the wrong enemies? Were their finances a mess? Were they restless souls always on the lookout for new opportunities and new adventures? We don't know. We just don't know. But here's what I suspect. There was something about Jesus. Something about his manner. Something in the way he looked at them. Something the way his voice sounded that stirred them deep in their souls, awakening some part of them they had long forgotten, or maybe had never, ever known. Something about him that brought out the best in themselves. Something that he saw in them, and they in turn began, even just vaguely, to begin to suspect about themselves, that made them feel differently about themselves and the world than they'd ever felt before. For the rest of their lives, they would remember that day and that invitation. Sure, they'd never live up to his standards and expectations, and sure, they'd make their share of mistakes and foolish assertions, but he was as close to the real deal as anyone they would ever encounter. Who wouldn't want to be part of something like that? Who wouldn't want to follow that man? So now here's the thing. Mark may tell us in a few words what it cost the disciples to follow Jesus. Their fishing nets and their fishing buddies. That was it. But Mark then spends the whole rest of his gospel showing us what they got by following Jesus. And what was that? They got front row seats to watch the gates of heaven swing wide open and God's richest blessings be poured out on person after person, Time after time, they watched it happen, and even when they didn't understand it and could not explain it, slowly, they began to believe it. They saw the sick being cured, the unclean and diseased being welcomed and restored to wholeness, those with troubled minds and spirits being set free, the lame walking, the deaf hearing, the blind seeing, the dead brought back to life, and the outcast continually welcomed home and given a fresh start in life. And always, whether spoken aloud or silently, the message that God is in love with the world and that the realm of God is closer to us than we can ever realize. To follow Jesus, then, is not merely to trace his footsteps or chase after him, hoping that something good might happen, but it is to be open to the possibility of actually being changed ourselves from the inside out. Such was the case for Simon. After encountering Jesus by the seashore, after encountering Simon by the seashore at the beginning of chapter 1, we visit his home at the end of that chapter. 2 chapters later, we run into him again, only this time he's no longer called Simon, but Simon Peter, as a result of having been given a new name and a new identity by Jesus. Surely Paul had this in mind when he wrote, "If anyone is in Christ, they are a new person. The old is gone, a new life has begun." Did Simon ask for this change of name and identity? Perhaps not directly. But what else did it possibly mean when he took up Jesus' invitation and left everything behind him to begin a brand new story? I told Jesus is what the spiritual says. I told Jesus is what Mike sang at the beginning of the service. I told Jesus, be all right if you change my name. If you change my name. If you change my name. Sometimes that might mean taking your life in a whole new, unexpected direction. And sometimes it just might mean letting your heart be broken wide open by the pain and suffering of others, by the incredible wonder and beauty of the world, by a brand new baby cradled in your arms, by angry protests against injustice, by the sight of an aging couple holding hands after all these years, by forgiving and being forgiven and saying, I'm sorry. By the melody of a favorite song or hymn, by a long prayed for expression of regret and reconciliation, by a decision to put your trust and faith in God's good news. Whatever it might be, on that day you too will experience the fullness of life as if for the very first time. On that day you too will know the impulse that led Peter, once named Simon, and the others to jump at the chance to know true life even if they couldn't fully understand or explain it. May it be so for you. May it be so for me.